It's Ask the Expert with Brenda Hollingsworth from Auger Hollingsworth. Live phone calls on the air, 613-789-6559, extension 2803, ottawa.morning at ctv.ca, by email. Find us on Facebook, too, and get those questions in. We're talking about excuses that insurance companies make to try and avoid paying you a claim, especially on injury here. So one of the confusing ones that you said a few headlines here, and one of the confusing ones was you could have avoided, or you're partially at fault for the collision.
Right.
How does that work in the insurance company's mind?
Yeah, so I mean, there's scenarios that we all know about. For example, a rear end accident.
Okay, yeah.
The insurance company will say something like, "Well, you stopped suddenly."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as is your right on the road.
That's right. So in Ontario, there are some jurisdictions where if you stop suddenly, you can be partially at fault. Ontario's not one of them.
Right.
So you are, as the driver behind, you're obligated to leave enough space so that you can stop in an emergency.
Right.
But if you're a layperson and you're on the phone with an insurance adjuster, you don't know that necessarily.
Right. Okay.
But that is not the law. If you stop and you're rear-ended, maybe if your brake lights aren't working, you could be partially at fault, but even then only partially. But apart from that, you're not at fault.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And there have been some outrageous claims on that too, right?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, and these don't always come from the insurance company. Sometimes they come from the at-fault driver himself. I had a case where a driver is driving on the Queensway, comes into the oncoming lane out in the Cumberland area, and his excuse was, well, your client should have gotten out of the way. I had a red car. She should have seen me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting to have you there, because that statement would make me so angry I wouldn't be able to reasonably argue. So I would have you on hand for that. All right. How about no one else was injured in the accident? So how could you be injured?
Yeah, that one actually comes up a lot, especially when my client is quite seriously injured. And that just happens, right? The position you're in the car, where the impact was, what your body's position was. I mean, I've had a client who had a spinal cord injury, and the only other injured person in a vehicle had a broken wrist, and everybody else walked away unscathed.
Right.
So it's just, I mean, that's not a reason.
Well, it sounds like the hammer and the nail to me, right? When one can get hurt and the other not. So.
Right.
Okay. Your car didn't suffer much damage, so how can you be injured?
Yeah, this is one that we face all the time, and if you're representing yourself, you're going to face this for sure. If your car's not totaled, you have to really make a pitch for how you could have been injured in that accident. So you have to understand, so make a mental note after your accident, where was my body at the time of impact?
Okay.
Because a fairly small nudge can make a big difference if you're turned. We've talked about that before, where like if you're at a stoplight and you've turned to get your coffee, or you've turned to talk to your friend, there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But if your body's twisted, you're going to be more seriously injured than if you're facing fully in front. So there's lots of reasons. The other thing is, a lot of cars have trailer hitches or crash bars or different things on the front or the back of them that absorb shock, so they might preserve the car, but they don't change the impact that you're feeling inside the car.
Here's a question I've always wondered, because they come out at such a force. Can a person be injured by the airbag?
Yes.
Okay.
So I had a client who actually lost sight in an eye because a piece of the dashboard actually broke off with the airbag.
Which you would prefer to death, honestly, right?
Yes.
You're not perfect, but you're happy to have the airbag anyway.
Yeah, and the other thing is lots of sternum injuries, chest injuries from fractured ribs.
Wow.
Again, that's a lot of force in that accident, and you're probably better off with the broken ribs, but pretty unpleasant. That's a painful injury.
Again, it bears repeating why we don't put kids in the front seat with airbags, because they come out at such a rate.
Yeah.
Also, this one is interesting to me. There is no objective evidence of your injuries.
Right.
Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, so this is actually a very common problem, whether you have a lawyer or not. If you have so-called invisible injuries, so a psychological injury like depression or PTSD.
You can have PTSD after a particularly traumatic accident.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? If you fear that you're going to die, you may well end up with PTSD.
Okay.
Or soft tissue injury like sprains, strains. Those can be very nasty. Like fracture doesn't equal worse than sprain or strain.
I've heard doctors say sometimes the sprains can be much worse than fractures.
Right. So the insurance company thinks, well, if it doesn't show up on an x-ray, a jury isn't going to believe they're injured.
Okay.
And so they'll lowball you because they are taking the chance that an Ottawa jury isn't going to award compensation to someone whose injuries don't show up in an MRI or an X-ray.
Okay. So that's some of the excuses that an insurance company can come up with. Next, we're going to talk about an ongoing situation, in fact, with Bruce Jenner on the highway, not specifically about what happened there, but about what might be looked at in an investigation and what you need to do to think about protecting yourself. And the Ask the Expert continues with Brenda Hollingsworth from OJ Hollingsworth. Phone in if you have questions. Those are always priorities. 789-6559, extension 2803, or on Facebook, CTV.